The year was 2387 and the Galactic Court of Justice stood like a giant crystal tower on the world of Nexus. Prime, inside its walls, beings from 12 different worlds gathered to watch what would become the most important trial in galactic history. The courtroom buzzed with strange sounds as aliens spoke in their native tongues while universal translators worked to make sense of the chaos. Richard Kane sat alone at the defense table, looking smaller than anyone had ever seen him before. The billionaire who owned Kane Industries and controlled half of Earth's technology sector now faced charges that could destroy everything he had built. The Federation accused him of breaking the technology-sharing accords by keeping human innovations away from other species. If found guilty, he would lose his company, and humanity might lose its place in the galactic community. The prosecution table was crowded with alien lawyers led by Advocate Silthrin from the Vegan Collective. Her serpentine body coiled behind the table as her forked tongue tasted the air for signs of fear. Next to her sat a crystalline being whose thoughts moved like light through its transparent body, and a furry creature whose 6 arms shuffled through digital tablets containing evidence against Kane. Judge Zethkar presided over the courtroom from a floating platform that moved slowly around the room. The massive crystal being stood 12 feet tall, and its body glowed with inner light that changed color with its emotions. 2 other judges flanked the main platform, including a gaseous entity contained in a force field and a mechanical being whose circuits sparked with each thought. Kane had arrived that morning with the best legal team money could buy. Victoria Lang was Earth's top galactic lawyer with 15 years of experience in Federation courts. Her team of 6 assistants had prepared for months, gathering evidence and building what they believed was an unbreakable defense. But something had gone wrong during the morning session, and now Kane sat alone while his legal team packed their files. The gallery was packed with reporters from across the galaxy. Human news crews pointed their cameras at Kane, while alien journalists used devices that recorded thoughts and emotions directly. The trial was being broadcast live to billions of beings across known space, and everyone wanted to see if the arrogant humans would finally be brought down. Marcus Washington pushed his cleaning cart down the hallway outside the courtroom, completely unnoticed by the crowd of reporters and officials. He was just a janitor to them and invisible like most service workers throughout the galaxy. His dark skin showed the years he had spent working in the Detroit Public Defender's office before everything went wrong. Now at 45, he mopped floors and emptied trash cans in the most prestigious court in galactic space. 3 years ago, Marcus had arrived on Nexus Prime with nothing but the clothes on his back and a determination to start over. Earth's legal system had failed him when corrupt prosecutors sent him to prison for a crime he never committed. By the time DNA evidence cleared his name, his law license was gone. His marriage was over and his reputation was destroyed. The Galactic Court offered him a job cleaning floors, and he took it gratefully. What nobody knew was that Marcus spent his evenings in the court's law library studying Federation legal codes. He had learned to read Centauri contract law and memorized Rigelian criminal procedures. The universal translators that other humans struggled with came naturally to him, and he could now speak basic phrases in 7 alien languages. Knowledge was the one thing they could never take away from him. Inside the courtroom, Victoria Lang was making her final preparations to abandon her client. She had discovered something in the evidence that morning that changed everything. Hidden in Kane's corporate files were communications that seemed to prove he had deliberately kept technology from alien species, not for security reasons, but because he believed humans were superior. The documents painted him as a racist who saw other species as inferior and unworthy of human innovations. Kane tried to explain that the documents were taken out of context, but Victoria would not listen. She had built her career on defending innocent clients, and she refused to help someone she now believed was guilty. Her dramatic exit from the courtroom left Kane stunned and facing the most important trial of his life without representation. Judge Zethkar's body glowed red with irritation as he watched the human legal team file out of the courtroom. The crystal being had little patience for human drama and even less tolerance for delays. He announced that proceedings would resume in exactly 1 hour, with or without defense counsel. The Federation's case against Kane would move forward regardless of his legal problems. The alien prosecutors smiled with satisfaction as they watched Kane's team disappear. Advocate Silthrin had worked for months to build this case, and she knew that no lawyer on Nexus Prime would take Kane's defense with such short notice. The human would be forced to represent himself against a team of experienced galactic prosecutors, and the result would be swift and decisive. Kane's hands shook as he stared at the evidence files scattered across his table. He was a brilliant businessman who had built an empire through careful planning and smart decisions, but legal proceedings were completely outside his expertise. The prosecution had thousands of pages of regulations and precedents that he could never master in time. Without proper representation, he was doomed. Marcus continued his cleaning routine as the courtroom emptied for the recess. He had watched hundreds of trials from the sidelines and had never seen anything like the chaos that just unfolded. The human defendant looked broken and desperate while the alien prosecutors celebrated what they clearly saw as an easy victory. Something about the scene bothered Marcus, though he could not quite identify what felt wrong. As he wiped down the empty defense table, Marcus noticed the scattered legal files that Victoria Lang had left behind. His curiosity got the better of him, and he glanced at the top document. What he saw made his blood run cold. The evidence against Kane had been compiled by investigators who clearly did not understand human business practices or the cultural context behind Kane's decisions. The communications that had convinced Victoria to quit were indeed damaging, but Marcus could see that they had been carefully selected to create a false impression. Years of experience in criminal defense had taught him to recognize prosecutorial overreach, and this case reeked of it. Someone wanted Kane destroyed, and they were willing to manipulate evidence to make it happen. Kane returned to the courtroom early, hoping to find some miracle solution to his impossible situation. Instead, he found a janitor reading through his legal files with the intensity of a scholar. The sight would have been amusing under different circumstances, but Kane was too desperate to care about protocol or proper procedures. Marcus looked up from the documents and saw a man whose life was about to be destroyed by forces he did not understand. The billionaire who controlled vast resources and employed thousands of people now faced the same kind of injustice that had destroyed Marcus's own life years earlier. Sometimes the universe had a strange sense of humor about bringing people together when they needed each other. The clock on the courtroom wall showed 30 minutes until proceedings would resume, and Kane still had no lawyer. Marcus made a decision that would change both their lives forever. He closed the legal file and looked directly at the man who everyone assumed was guilty of crimes against galactic harmony. What happened next would either save them both or destroy any chance either of them had for redemption. Kane stared at the janitor who was reading his legal files with the focus of a trained attorney. The situation was so bizarre that Kane wondered if the stress of the trial was making him see things that were not really there. He had expected to find his courtroom empty except for cleaning supplies, but instead, he discovered someone who seemed genuinely interested in understanding his case. Marcus closed the file and looked up at Kane with eyes that held both sympathy and determination. He had seen that same look of desperate confusion on the faces of his former clients back in Detroit when the system turned against them. The difference was that Kane had resources and connections that most defendants could only dream of, but none of that mattered when facing a legal system designed to destroy him. Kane approached the defense table cautiously, as if Marcus might disappear if he moved too quickly. The billionaire had spent his entire career surrounded by people who wanted something from him, whether it was money or influence or access to his technology. But the janitor studying his case seemed different somehow, as if he actually cared about the outcome for reasons that had nothing to do with personal gain. Marcus stood up slowly and extended his hand in the traditional human greeting that most aliens found strange and primitive. Kane shook it gratefully, surprised by the firm grip and the direct eye contact that spoke of confidence and competence. For the first time since Victoria Lang had abandoned him, Kane felt like someone was actually on his side. The janitor introduced himself as Marcus Washington and explained that he had been watching the trial from the beginning. His voice carried the authority of someone who understood legal proceedings, even though his clothing marked him as building maintenance staff. Kane listened with growing amazement as Marcus outlined the flaws he had already identified in the prosecution's case. Marcus explained that he had once been a lawyer himself, before circumstances forced him to start over in a different career. He did not go into details about what had happened on Earth, but Kane could hear the pain in his voice when he mentioned losing his license. The billionaire understood better than most how quickly success could turn into failure, when powerful forces decided to destroy someone. Kane asked if Marcus would be willing to represent him in the trial that was about to resume. The request was desperate and probably illegal, but Kane had run out of options and time. Marcus hesitated before answering because taking the case would mean revealing his legal background to people who might ask uncomfortable questions about his past. But Marcus also knew that innocent people deserved competent representation regardless of their wealth or social status. He had spent 3 years cleaning courtrooms and watching alien lawyers make basic mistakes in cases involving human defendants. The Federation's legal system was designed by species who thought differently than humans, and even experienced Earth lawyers often missed important cultural nuances. Marcus told Kane that there might be a way to make the arrangement legal under Galactic Federation law. An obscure provision in the court rules allowed any sapient being to serve as counsel for a defendant as long as certain conditions were met. The rule was rarely used because most beings preferred lawyers from their own species, but it existed for exactly this kind of emergency situation. Kane agreed immediately and asked what he needed to do to make Marcus his official representative. The janitor explained that they would need to file the paperwork with the court clerk and that Judge Zethkar would have to approve the arrangement before proceedings could continue. There was also the question of whether Marcus could actually practice law on Nexus Prime given his complicated history on Earth. They walked together to the clerk's office where a bored Aquarian processed legal documents with tentacles that moved faster than human eyes could follow. The blue-skinned being barely looked up as Marcus filed the request for emergency counsel appointment. The clerk stamped the papers with practiced indifference and told them that Judge Zethkar would rule on the motion when court resumed in 15 minutes. Word of the unusual arrangement spread quickly through the courthouse as reporters and court officials learned that Kane's new lawyer was the building's janitor. The alien prosecution team gathered around Advocate Silthrin to discuss this unexpected development. Most of them assumed it was a desperate publicity stunt that would only make their victory more decisive. Silthrin tasted the air with her forked tongue and detected the scent of human fear, mixed with something else she could not identify. Her serpentine species had evolved to read the emotional states of prey animals, and she sensed that both Kane and his janitor were more dangerous than they appeared. Something about their confidence seemed genuine rather than desperate. The courtroom filled again as beings from across the galaxy returned to watch the continuation of the trial. The gallery buzzed with conversation in dozens of languages as aliens discussed the strange turn of events. Many of them had never seen a human janitor before, and they were curious about what kind of defense such a person could possibly mount. Judge Zethkar returned to his floating platform with his crystal body glowing a neutral blue color that indicated careful consideration. The massive being had presided over thousands of cases during his long career, and he had seen every possible legal maneuver attempted by desperate defendants. This request for emergency counsel was unusual, but not unprecedented. Marcus and Kane stood before the judge's platform as the crystal being reviewed the paperwork that would determine their fate. Judge Zethkar's voice resonated through the courtroom, with harmonics that made the walls vibrate slightly. He asked Marcus to state his qualifications for representing a defendant in a case involving complex Federation technology law. Marcus took a deep breath and began to speak in fluent galactic standard with accent patterns that impressed even the universal translators. He outlined his legal education on Earth and his years of experience in criminal defense work. More importantly, he demonstrated his knowledge of Federation law by citing relevant cases and precedents that applied to Kane's situation. The prosecution team looked increasingly uncomfortable as Marcus quoted obscure rulings from Centauri trade courts and referenced diplomatic agreements between Earth and the Regelian Empire. This was not the performance they had expected from a courthouse janitor, and Advocate Silthrin began to realize that their easy victory might not be as certain as they had assumed. Judge Zethkar tested Marcus further by asking him to explain the difference between vegan contract interpretation and human business customs. The question was designed to expose any lack of understanding about cross-species legal issues. Marcus answered by walking the judge through 3 different precedent cases that established the framework for resolving such cultural conflicts. The crystal being's body shifted to a warmer yellow color indicating approval and perhaps amusement at this unexpected turn of events. Judge Zethkar had dealt with many human lawyers over the years, and most of them struggled with the nuances of multi-species legal practice. This janitor seemed to understand concepts that escaped some of the most expensive attorneys in the galaxy. Kane watched the exchange with growing hope, as he realized that Marcus was not just competent, but genuinely skilled at navigating Federation legal complexities. The billionaire had always prided himself on recognizing talent regardless of where he found it, and he was beginning to suspect that losing Victoria Lang might have been the best thing that could have happened to his case. Marcus concluded his presentation by requesting permission to represent Kane under the Emergency Council provisions of Federation law. He acknowledged his unusual background, but argued that competent representation was more important than conventional credentials. The courtroom fell silent as everyone waited for Judge Zethkar to render his decision. The crystal being considered for several long moments before announcing that he would allow Marcus to serve as Kane's counsel for the duration of the trial. The decision sent shocked murmurs through the gallery as aliens tried to process what they had just witnessed. A human janitor had just been approved to practice law in the most prestigious court in the galaxy. Advocate Silthran rose to object, but Judge Zethkar cut her off with a sharp harmonic that indicated his patience was wearing thin. The serpentine prosecutor had hoped to delay proceedings further, but the judge was clearly ready to move forward with the case regardless of who represented the defendant. Marcus returned to the defense table with Kane, knowing that he had just committed himself to the most important case of his career. The billionaire looked at his unlikely advocate with newfound respect, and perhaps the first genuine hope he had felt since the charges were filed. Together, they began preparing for a legal battle that would determine not just Kane's fate, but humanity's place in the galactic community. The prosecution team huddled together, discussing strategy adjustments now that they faced an opponent who clearly understood Federation law better than they had expected. Advocate Silthran realized that her careful plans for an easy victory would need to be reconsidered. The human janitor had just transformed himself into a legitimate threat to everything she had worked to accomplish. Advocate Silthran rose from her position at the prosecution table, with the fluid grace of her serpentine species. Her scales shifted color slightly as she prepared to present the case against Richard Kane to the assembled judges and gallery. The courtroom fell silent except for the soft humming of translation devices working to convert her words into dozens of different languages. The prosecution's opening statement painted humans as a dangerous and selfish species that refused to share their technological advances with the rest of the galactic community. Silthran explained that when humanity joined the Federation 50 years ago, they had agreed to participate in the technology sharing accords that required all member species to make their innovations available to others. She displayed holographic evidence, showing Kane Industries' most advanced technologies, including artificial intelligence systems that surpassed anything developed by other species. The quantum computing breakthroughs that Kane's company had achieved were decades ahead of similar research being conducted by the Centauri Science Collective. Most damning of all were the communication technologies that allowed humans to coordinate across vast distances in ways that other species found almost impossible to understand. The serpentine advocate argued that Kane had deliberately hidden these technologies from alien researchers who could have used them to benefit their own civilizations. She presented communications between Kane and his research teams that discussed the importance of maintaining human technological superiority over other species. The evidence seemed to show a pattern of arrogance and discrimination that violated the fundamental principles of the Federation. Marcus listened carefully to every word while taking notes in a mixture of English and Galactic Standard that would have confused most translators. He had spent 3 years observing alien legal tactics, and he recognized the prosecution's strategy. They were trying to make this case about human nature rather than Kane's specific actions, which was a much broader and more dangerous charge. When Silthran finished her presentation, Judge Zethkar's crystal body glowed with the blue light that indicated careful consideration. The massive being had heard similar arguments before in cases involving different species, but there was something about humanity that made these issues more complex. Humans seemed to create technology in ways that other species found difficult to understand or replicate. Marcus stood to present his opening defense, and immediately surprised everyone by conceding that Kane Industries had indeed kept certain technologies exclusive to human use. The admission sent shocked whispers through the gallery as aliens wondered if the janitor was simply incompetent or if he had some strategy that they could not see. But Marcus quickly explained that the prosecution's case was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how human innovation actually worked. He told the court that human technological development was different from the collective research methods used by other species. While aliens worked together through shared consciousness or democratic decision-making, humans created through individual inspiration and personal struggle. He presented evidence showing that every major human breakthrough had come from individual scientists or small teams working in isolation. The artificial intelligence systems that Silthrin had shown as evidence were not the result of massive collective efforts like those used by the hive mind Zephyrians. Instead, they had been created by single humans, working alone with ideas that came from dreams or random thoughts or sudden flashes of insight. Marcus explained that when other species tried to copy human technologies without understanding the creative process behind them, the results were often catastrophic. He showed the court documentation of the Regalian Empire's attempt to replicate human AI systems 3 years earlier. The alien scientists had perfectly copied the code and hardware, but their version had developed what humans would call a nervous breakdown and nearly destroyed their homeworld's infrastructure. The problem was not that humans were unwilling to share, but that human innovations required human intuition and creativity to function properly. Marcus compared it to trying to teach someone to paint by giving them a brush and colors without explaining how to see beauty or express emotion through art. The tools were useless without the understanding that made them meaningful. Judge Zethkar interrupted to ask how this differed from normal technology transfer between species, which happened successfully throughout the Federation. Marcus responded by explaining that most alien technologies were based on logical principles that could be understood and replicated by any intelligent species. Human technology often incorporated elements that seemed random or emotional but were actually essential to its function. The crystal being asked for a specific example, and Marcus described the breakthrough that had led to human quantum computing. The scientist who made the discovery had been trying to solve a completely different problem when she noticed that certain quantum particles seemed to behave like jazz musicians improvising together. That observation led her to design quantum systems that used controlled chaos rather than rigid programming. When Regalian scientists tried to replicate her work, they focused on the mathematics and engineering. While dismissing the jazz analogy as primitive human thinking, their quantum computers worked perfectly for exactly 72 hours before collapsing into what could only be described as quantum depression. The systems had all the right components but lacked the creative spark that made them truly functional. Advocate Silthrin objected that Marcus was making excuses for human selfishness by claiming their technology was somehow special or unique. She argued that all species had their own approaches to innovation, but that did not excuse them from sharing the results with others. The Federation was built on cooperation and mutual benefit, not on claims of superiority. Marcus agreed that cooperation was important, but explained that forced sharing could actually harm both species involved. He presented case studies showing that when aliens successfully adapted human technologies, they had always done so through collaborative research that respected the creative differences between species. The failures had occurred when aliens tried to simply copy human work without understanding the thought processes behind it. The prosecution team grew increasingly frustrated as Marcus systematically dismantled their arguments using logic and evidence that they had not expected from a courthouse janitor. Silthrin had prepared for a case against an arrogant human businessman, but instead found herself debating fundamental questions about the nature of intelligence and creativity with someone who clearly understood both human and alien perspectives. Marcus continued his defense by explaining that Kane's apparent technology hoarding was actually an attempt to prevent the kind of disasters that had occurred when other species tried to rush the adoption of human innovations. The Billionaire had been working with alien research teams to develop collaborative approaches that would allow successful technology transfer while respecting the creative differences between species. He showed the court communications between Kane Industries and research institutions across the galaxy, proving that Kane had been actively engaged in joint projects with alien scientists. The work was proceeding slowly because it required aliens to understand human creative processes, while also teaching humans to appreciate alien logical approaches. The result would be technologies that truly belonged to both species rather than crude copies that were doomed to fail. Judge Zethkar asked why Kane had not simply explained this to Federation investigators, instead of allowing the situation to escalate into a criminal trial. Marcus replied that Kane had tried to explain, but that the investigators were all from species that approached problems through collective analysis. They could not understand Kane's insistence that creative collaboration could not be rushed or forced. The crystal being's body shifted to a warmer color as he considered Marcus's arguments. Judge Zethkar had presided over many cases involving cross-species misunderstandings, but this case seemed to involve fundamental differences in how different species thought about innovation and creativity. The human approach was not necessarily wrong, but it was certainly different from anything he had encountered before. Marcus concluded his opening statement by asking the court to consider whether the Federation benefited more from forced sharing that often led to failure or from patient collaboration that produced genuine understanding between species. He argued that Kane's careful approach to technology transfer was not selfish but responsible, and that rushing the process would ultimately harm everyone involved. The prosecution team huddled together during the brief recess, trying to adjust their strategy to deal with Marcus's unexpected competence. Silthrin realized that her simple narrative about human greed and arrogance was not going to be sufficient against a defense that reframed the entire case in terms of cross-species understanding. She would need to find new ways to attack Kane's credibility and Marcus's arguments. Kane watched his unlikely advocate with growing admiration as Marcus prepared for the next phase of the trial. The billionaire had always believed that human creativity was special, but he had never been able to articulate why in ways that aliens could understand. Marcus seemed to have found a way to explain human nature that made sense. The trial entered its second day with Marcus feeling more confident about Kane's chances, but also more aware of the larger forces working against them. During the evening recess, he had used his janitor access to clean areas of the courthouse that were normally restricted to court officials. What he discovered in those private spaces changed his understanding of the entire case. While emptying trash containers in the prosecution's preparation room, Marcus found discarded communications that had not been completely destroyed. The fragments showed contact between Advocate Silthrin and representatives from major alien technology corporations, including the Centauri Industrial Complex and the Rigelian Science Consortium. The conversations suggested coordination that went far beyond normal prosecution preparation. Marcus pieced together enough of the communications to realize that Kane was not just facing criminal charges, but was the target of a coordinated effort by alien corporations who feared human technological advancement. The companies that had failed to successfully adapt human innovations were now using the legal system to force humans to share their secrets whether they wanted to or not. The prosecution resumed their case by calling Dr. Elena Rodriguez as their star witness. The human scientist had worked closely with Kane Industries for 5 years before leaving to start her own research company on Mars. Her testimony would be crucial because she was the only person who could speak with authority about Kane's internal decision-making process regarding technology sharing. Elena took the witness stand with obvious reluctance and avoided looking directly at Kane as she was sworn in. Marcus noticed that her hands shook slightly as she answered preliminary questions about her background and her work history with Kane Industries. Something about her demeanor suggested that she was not testifying voluntarily. Advocate Silthrin led Elena through a carefully prepared series of questions designed to portray Kane as someone who deliberately sabotaged joint research projects to prevent aliens from accessing human innovations. Elena testified that Kane had repeatedly overruled her recommendations to share research data with alien partners and had canceled several promising collaborative projects without explanation. The most damaging part of Elena's testimony involved a joint project with Centauri scientists that had been developing new propulsion systems for interstellar travel. According to Elena, Kane had ordered the project terminated just as the alien researchers were beginning to understand the human approach to engineering. She claimed that Kane told her privately that aliens were not ready for such advanced technology. Marcus carefully watched Elena's body language as she gave her testimony and noticed several inconsistencies that suggested she was not telling the complete truth. Her eye movements and speech patterns indicated stress levels that were inappropriate for someone simply recounting past events. She seemed more like someone who was being forced to say things she did not believe. During cross-examination, Marcus began gently by asking Elena about her current research projects and her company's financial situation. He learned that her Mars-based laboratory had recently received a massive investment from the Rigelian Science Consortium, which gave the alien organization significant control over her work. The timing of the investment coincided exactly with her agreement to testify against Kane. Marcus then asked Elena to describe the specific technical problems that had led to the cancellation of the Joint Propulsion Project. Her answers revealed that the alien researchers had been struggling to understand fundamental concepts about human engineering approaches. The project was canceled not because Kane wanted to hoard technology, but because forcing it to continue would have resulted in dangerous failures. Elena admitted under questioning that the Centauri scientists had been trying to apply their species' collective decision-making processes to engineering problems that required individual creativity and intuition. The human engineers working on the project had become frustrated because their alien partners kept overruling innovative solutions in favor of approaches that had been approved by committee. Marcus pressed further, and Elena reluctantly acknowledged that Kane had actually tried to save the project by proposing a different collaborative structure that would have allowed both species to contribute their strengths. The Centauri representatives had rejected his proposal because it would have required them to accept that some problems could not be solved through collective analysis. As the cross-examination continued, Elena became increasingly uncomfortable and finally broke down when Marcus asked her about threats that had been made against her family on Mars. Through tears, she admitted that unknown parties had contacted her shortly after the charges against Kane were filed and had made it clear that her children's safety depended on her cooperation with the prosecution. The revelation sent shockwaves through the courtroom as aliens and humans alike realized that the case involved far more than simple technology-sharing violations. Judge Zethkar immediately called for a recess and demanded that security investigate Elena's claims about threats against her family. The prosecution team looked stunned as their carefully planned case began to collapse. During the recess, Marcus used his access to the courthouse communication systems to contact security officials on Mars, who confirmed that Elena's children had been placed under protective custody after receiving anonymous threats. The threats had specifically mentioned their mother's upcoming testimony and had made it clear that their safety depended on what she said in court. Marcus also discovered that similar threats had been made against other potential witnesses who might have testified in Kane's favor. Several human scientists who had worked on joint projects with alien researchers had received communications warning them to stay away from the trial. The pattern suggested a coordinated effort to isolate Kane and prevent anyone from supporting his defense. When court resumed, Judge Zethkar announced that Elena's children had been taken into protective custody by Federation security forces and that a full investigation would be launched into the threats against prosecution witnesses. The crystal being's body glowed with the red light that indicated serious anger, as he warned all parties that witness intimidation would not be tolerated in his courtroom. Advocate Silthrin tried to continue with her case, but the damage to her credibility was obvious to everyone in the courtroom. Marcus moved for dismissal of all charges based on prosecutorial misconduct, but Judge Zethkar denied the motion while agreeing that the new evidence would be carefully considered in reaching a final verdict. Marcus spent the evening recess reviewing everything he had learned about the forces working against Kane, and began to understand the true scope of what they were facing. This was not just a criminal trial, but a coordinated attack on human technological independence by alien corporations that feared being left behind in the galactic economy. The evidence of witness intimidation proved that powerful interests were willing to use illegal methods to ensure Kane's conviction. Marcus realized that winning this case would require more than just proving Kane's innocence, but exposing the entire conspiracy that had brought them to trial. The stakes were higher than either of them had originally understood. Kane met with Marcus late that evening to discuss their options going forward. The billionaire was shaken by the revelation that Elena's family had been threatened, but also relieved that the truth was finally coming out. He told Marcus that he had suspected for months that someone was orchestrating events to destroy his company, but had not realized how far his enemies were willing to go. Marcus explained his theory that the case was being driven by alien corporations that wanted to force technology transfer through legal means, since they had failed to achieve it through legitimate collaboration. Kane agreed and provided additional evidence of pressure that had been applied to his company by alien business interests who wanted access to human innovations without understanding the creative processes behind them. They spent hours reviewing communications and business records that showed a pattern of increasing pressure from alien corporations who were falling behind in technological development. The companies involved represented the most established and conservative elements of galactic society, who viewed human innovation as a threat to their traditional dominance. As they prepared for the next phase of the trial, Marcus and Kane both understood that they were fighting for more than just Kane's freedom or his company's future. They were defending humanity's right to develop technology in their own way, without being forced to conform to alien expectations about how innovation should work. The prosecution would try to recover from the damage to their case, but Marcus knew that he now had the evidence needed to expose the conspiracy behind Kane's charges. The question was whether Judge Zethkar and the galactic legal system would be willing to acknowledge that some of the Federation's most powerful interests had corrupted the pursuit of justice for their own benefit. Marcus began the third day of trial with a completely different strategy than anyone expected. Instead of simply defending Kane's actions, he decided to put human nature itself on trial, but in a positive light. He would show the court that humanity's approach to innovation was not selfish or superior, but simply different in ways that benefited the entire galaxy. His first witness was Dr. Sarah Kim, a quantum physicist from Earth who had developed the breakthrough technology that allowed faster-than-light communication between human colonies. She was a small woman with graying hair who spoke softly, but with absolute confidence about her work. Marcus knew that her story would help the court understand how human creativity actually functioned. Dr. Kim explained that her discovery had come not from logical analysis or systematic research, but from a dream she had experienced after spending months trying to solve what seemed like an impossible problem. In the dream, she saw quantum particles dancing together like children playing games, and when she woke up, she understood how to make them communicate across vast distances. Advocate Silthrin objected that dream-based research was not legitimate science, but Marcus pointed out that the technology worked perfectly and had revolutionized galactic communication. Judge Zethkar was fascinated by the idea that scientific breakthroughs could come from unconscious mental processes rather than deliberate investigation. Marcus asked Dr. Kim to explain why attempts by alien scientists to replicate her work had failed even when they had access to all her technical specifications. She replied that the aliens had focused on the mathematical formulas and engineering details, while ignoring the intuitive understanding that made the technology possible. They could build the devices, but could not make them function reliably. The next witness was Jake Martinez, a human artist who had revolutionized dimensional physics by approaching it as a creative problem rather than a scientific one. His work had led to breakthrough technologies in space travel and energy generation, but his methods were so unconventional that most alien scientists dismissed them as primitive human nonsense. Jake explained that he had started painting abstract representations of dimensional relationships because the mathematical equations seemed too limiting to capture what he sensed about the nature of space and time. His paintings had inspired human physicists to develop new theories that led directly to practical technologies that surpassed anything achieved through traditional research methods. When a Volcoid mathematician in the gallery tried to interrupt with logical objections to Jake's approach, the artist simply smiled and said that he painted dimensional relationships because they felt beautiful, and the useful mathematics had followed naturally from the aesthetic principles. The alien scientist struggled to understand how beauty could lead to functional technology. Marcus called several more witnesses, including engineers, inventors, and researchers who told similar stories about human innovation coming from sources that other species found impossible to understand. A human engineer described developing new propulsion systems by studying the flight patterns of birds on Earth. A computer scientist explained how observing human children at play had led to breakthroughs in artificial intelligence design. Each witness demonstrated that human technological advancement came not from the logical collective thinking preferred by other species, but from individual creativity, emotional insights, and the willingness to pursue ideas that seemed impossible or impractical. Marcus showed that these seemingly chaotic human traits consistently produced innovations that benefited everyone in the galaxy. Judge Zethkar asked why humans could not simply teach their creative methods to other species if the results were so beneficial. Marcus replied that creativity could not be taught like technical skills, because it required ways of thinking that were fundamentally different between species. Humans thought with their emotions and intuition, while most aliens relied on logic and collective analysis. Marcus presented evidence showing that successful technology transfer between humans and aliens had always occurred through collaborative projects where both species contributed their natural strengths. Humans provided creative insights and breakthrough concepts, while aliens contributed systematic analysis and practical implementation. Neither approach was superior, but they worked best when combined rather than when one species tried to copy the other. The prosecution fought back by arguing that this proved humans were dangerously unpredictable and should not be trusted with advanced technology. Advocate Silthrin brought in expert witnesses who testified that human emotional volatility made them unfit for membership in a civilized galactic community that valued stability and careful planning over chaotic innovation. A Centauri social. Scientists testified that human behavior patterns showed clear signs of psychological instability that made them unsuitable partners for long-term collaborative projects. He argued that humans changed their minds too frequently and pursued too many different approaches simultaneously to be reliable members of galactic civilization. Marcus cross-examined the alien expert by asking him to explain how human emotional volatility had led to breakthrough technologies that had benefited every species in the Federation. The Centauri scientist struggled to answer because his species' collective decision-making process could not accommodate the kind of rapid changes and multiple approaches that characterized human innovation. Marcus then called Dr. Patricia Lewis, a human psychologist who specialized in cross-species mental health issues. She explained that what aliens saw as human instability was actually a form of cognitive flexibility that allowed humans to adapt quickly to new situations and find creative solutions to unexpected problems. This mental agility was essential for innovation but appeared chaotic to species that preferred stability. Dr. Lewis presented research showing that human emotional responses were actually sophisticated information processing systems that allowed individuals to make complex decisions quickly without conscious analysis. Human intuition incorporated vast amounts of environmental and social data that would overwhelm the logical thinking processes preferred by most alien species. She argued that human emotional volatility was not a flaw, but a feature that had evolved to help humans survive in unpredictable environments. The same mental flexibility that made humans seem unstable to aliens also made them uniquely capable of developing new technologies and adapting to changing circumstances. Marcus asked Dr. Lewis to explain why successful human-alien collaborations required both species to work within their natural cognitive styles rather than trying to force conformity. She replied that each species had evolved different approaches to problem-solving, and that the best results came from combining these different perspectives rather than requiring everyone to think the same way. The courtroom grew quiet as aliens began to understand that Marcus was not arguing for human superiority, but for the value of cognitive diversity in galactic civilization. He was suggesting that different ways of thinking were resources that should be preserved and utilized rather than obstacles that needed to be overcome. Marcus concluded his presentation of witnesses by calling Kane himself to testify about his company's approach to cross-species collaboration. The billionaire explained that his apparent technology hoarding was actually an attempt to develop sustainable methods for sharing human innovations without causing the kind of catastrophic failures that had occurred when aliens tried to rush the adoption process. Kane described specific joint projects where human and alien researchers had worked together successfully, by respecting each other's cognitive differences and finding ways to combine their strengths. He showed that these collaborative approaches produced better results for everyone than either species could achieve working alone. When Advocate Silthrin cross-examined Kane, she tried to portray his collaborative approach as condescending toward alien capabilities. Kane replied that he respected alien intelligence, but believed that successful cooperation required understanding and accommodating cognitive differences rather than pretending they did not exist. Kane explained that his company's careful approach to technology sharing had prevented disasters while developing sustainable methods for cross-species collaboration. He argued that rushed technology transfer had harmed both human and alien interests, while patient collaborative development had produced innovations that truly belonged to all species involved. As the witness phase of the trial concluded, Marcus felt confident that he had successfully reframed the case from a simple question about technology sharing to a broader discussion about the value of cognitive diversity in galactic civilization. The prosecution would need to argue not just that Kane had violated Federation law, but that human approaches to innovation were inherently harmful to galactic society. Judge Zethkar announced that closing arguments would begin the following day, and that he expected both sides to address the larger questions about cross-species collaboration that had emerged during the trial. The crystal being's body glowed with colors that suggested deep thought, as he considered the complex issues that Marcus had raised about the nature of intelligence and creativity in galactic civilization. The evening before closing arguments, Marcus made a decision that would either save Kane or destroy them both. He used his janitor access to enter the courthouse late at night when security was minimal and most of the building was empty. His goal was to find evidence of the conspiracy he suspected was behind Kane's prosecution, but what he discovered exceeded his worst fears. The prosecution offices were locked, but Marcus had master keys that allowed him to clean every room in the building. He searched through digital files and communication logs that had been carelessly left accessible on desktop computers. What he found painted a picture of corruption that reached to the highest levels of galactic government. The case against Kane was being funded and directed by something called the Galactic Stability Council, which Marcus had never heard of. Despite his extensive study of Federation law and politics, further investigation revealed that this was a secret organization comprising representatives from the oldest and most powerful alien civilizations in the galaxy. The Council's communications showed that Kane's trial was just the beginning of a much larger plan to establish legal precedents that would effectively end human technological independence. They intended to use Kane's conviction to justify new regulations requiring all Federation species to submit their innovations for collective evaluation before implementation. Marcus found detailed strategic documents outlining how the Galactic Stability Council planned to gradually strip away human autonomy in space through a series of legal challenges and regulatory changes. The ultimate goal was to force humanity into a client relationship with older alien civilizations who would control human development and expansion. The documents revealed that several key prosecution witnesses had been bribed or threatened by council agents working through intermediary organizations. The threats against Elena Rodriguez's family were just one example of the intimidation tactics being used to ensure Kane's conviction. Even Judge Zethkar had received subtle pressure to rule against the human defendant. More disturbing was the discovery that Kane's alleged technology hoarding had actually prevented a galactic economic collapse. Several alien attempts to replicate human innovations without proper understanding had led to massive system failures across multiple worlds. Kane's careful approach to technology sharing had saved lives and prevented disasters, but this information had been suppressed by council agents. Marcus photographed as much evidence as possible using his personal communication device before carefully replacing everything exactly as he had found it. He knew that accessing this information was illegal and that he could face serious criminal charges if discovered, but he also knew that Kane's trial was part of a conspiracy that threatened humanity's future in the galaxy. As he prepared to leave the prosecution offices, Marcus heard footsteps in the hallway outside and realized that someone else was in the building. He quickly turned off the lights and hid behind a filing cabinet as the door opened and 3 figures entered the room. Their conversation would change his understanding of everything. He thought he knew about the case. The first voice belonged to Advocate Silthrin, but she was speaking in her native language rather than Galactic Standard. Marcus's translation software could only catch fragments, but he understood enough to realize that she was reporting to someone about the trial's progress. The second voice was mechanical and artificial, suggesting one of the robotic species from the Outer Rim. The third voice was the most disturbing because it was human. Someone from Earth was working with alien conspirators to ensure Kane's conviction and the destruction of human technological independence. Marcus strained to identify the speaker, but the voice was electronically disguised, making recognition impossible. Their conversation revealed that the conspiracy was concerned about Marcus's unexpected competence and the way he had reframed the trial around questions of cognitive diversity. The original plan had assumed that Kane would either represent himself poorly or hire an incompetent lawyer who would provide only token resistance to the prosecution's case. Marcus learned that backup plans were being activated to ensure Kane's conviction regardless of how well his defense performed. These plans included additional false evidence that would be introduced during closing arguments and pressure on Judge Zethkar through channels that the crystal being would find difficult to resist. The conspirators discussed the broader implications of their plan, including the establishment of technological oversight committees that would effectively give alien civilizations veto power over human innovation. They spoke about humanity as a threat that needed to be contained before humans became too advanced to control. The human voice expressed concern that the plan might fail if Marcus continued to expose the cultural misunderstandings behind the charges against Kane. The mechanical voice replied that Marcus's legal career had already been destroyed once and that it could be destroyed again if necessary. They had contingency plans for dealing with any human who became too effective at defending their species' interests. Marcus realized that his own past troubles on Earth had not been the result of simple corruption but part of a larger pattern of eliminating humans who might effectively resist alien attempts to control human development. His wrongful conviction and the destruction of his legal career had been orchestrated by the same forces that were now trying to destroy Kane. The conspirators concluded their meeting by agreeing to proceed with their backup plans regardless of the outcome of closing arguments. Kane would be convicted, and the legal precedents they needed would be established even if it required eliminating both Kane and Marcus as obstacles to their larger goals. After the conspirators left, Marcus remained hidden for another hour before carefully making his way out of the building. He now understood that winning Kane's trial would not be enough to protect humanity from the forces arrayed against them. The conspiracy was too deep and too powerful to be stopped by a single legal victory. Marcus spent the rest of the night reviewing the evidence he had gathered and developing a strategy that went far beyond defending Kane against the specific charges. He would need to expose the entire Galactic Stability Council and their plan to subjugate humanity through legal manipulation and economic pressure. The challenge was that much of the evidence he had gathered was obtained illegally and could not be presented in court without destroying his own credibility and exposing him to criminal prosecution. He would need to find ways to reveal the conspiracy through legitimate legal channels while protecting himself and Kane from retaliation. Marcus also realized that his success in defending Kane had marked him as a target for elimination by forces that had already destroyed his life once before. Win or lose the trial, his future in galactic society was now in doubt. The conspirators would not allow him to continue practicing law effectively if they perceived him as an ongoing threat to their plans. As dawn approached, Marcus made peace with the knowledge that his closing argument would probably be his last performance as a lawyer. He could expose the conspiracy and save Kane, but doing so would likely end his own career and possibly his life. The forces he was challenging had vast resources and few moral constraints about how they achieved their goals. Kane arrived at the courthouse early that morning and immediately sensed that something had changed about his unlikely advocate. Marcus looked like someone who had spent the night staring into an abyss and had decided to jump anyway. The billionaire asked what was wrong, but Marcus simply replied that they would discuss everything after the trial was concluded. Marcus spent the morning preparing his closing argument with the knowledge that it might be the most important speech ever delivered in defense of human independence. He would need to expose a conspiracy while defending a client and challenging the fundamental assumptions that governed relationships between species in the galactic community. The courtroom filled with beings from across the galaxy as word spread that closing arguments in the Kane case would address questions that went far beyond simple technology sharing violations. Marcus noticed several new faces in the gallery, including beings whose species he did not recognize and who seemed more interested in observing him than in following the legal proceedings. Judge Zethkar took his position, with his crystal body glowing the neutral blue that indicated careful attention to complex legal issues. The massive being announced that closing arguments would be limited to 2 hours per side and that he expected both prosecution and defense to address the broader questions about cross-species collaboration that had emerged during the trial. Marcus stood to deliver what he knew would be his final argument as a galactic lawyer, knowing that everything he had worked for during his years of exile on Nexus Prime had led to this moment. He would either save humanity's future or die trying, but he would not allow the conspiracy to succeed without exposing their crimes to galactic scrutiny. Marcus stood before the assembled judges and gallery, knowing that the next 2 hours would determine not just Kane's fate, but humanity's place in galactic civilization. He had spent 3 years cleaning the floors of this courtroom, and now he would either save his species or watch them be reduced to servitude by forces they barely understood. He began his closing argument not by defending Kane's actions, but by challenging the fundamental assumptions behind the prosecution's case. Marcus told the court that this trial was not really about technology sharing, but about whether different species could coexist in the galaxy while maintaining their unique approaches to innovation and development. Marcus presented evidence showing that every major galactic breakthrough in the past 50 years had involved human innovation or human-alien collaboration, where humans were allowed to work in their natural, chaotic style. He demonstrated that humanity's seemingly irrational approach to problem-solving had consistently produced solutions that logical alien minds had missed entirely. He showed the court documentation of breakthrough technologies that had emerged from human creativity, including faster-than-light communication systems that had revolutionized galactic trade and medical innovations that had saved billions of lives across dozens of worlds. None of these advances would have been possible using traditional alien research methods. Marcus argued that Kane's careful approach to technology sharing was not selfish, but responsible, because it ensured that innovations were transferred in ways that could be successfully utilized by alien civilizations. He presented evidence of disasters that had occurred when aliens tried to rush the adoption of human technologies without understanding the creative processes behind them. The prosecution's case was based on the assumption that all species should approach innovation in the same way, but Marcus showed that this assumption was both wrong and dangerous. Forcing conformity in thinking styles would reduce the galaxy's problem-solving capacity and make everyone more vulnerable to challenges that required creative solutions. Marcus then shifted his argument to address the broader conspiracy he had discovered while carefully avoiding mention of his illegal investigation. He presented evidence that was already part of the court record, showing patterns of witness intimidation and prosecutorial misconduct that suggested coordination by powerful interests outside the legal system. He argued that Kane was not just facing criminal charges but was the target of a coordinated effort to establish legal precedents that would undermine human technological independence. Marcus showed that successful prosecution of this case would create justification for regulations that would effectively end humanity's ability to develop innovations without alien oversight. Judge Zethkar interrupted to ask whether Marcus was suggesting that the prosecution was part of a larger conspiracy against humanity. Marcus replied carefully that the evidence showed coordination between prosecution witnesses and alien corporate interests that went beyond normal legal proceedings, and that this coordination served the interests of established galactic powers who feared human competition. Marcus presented his most dangerous argument by suggesting that some alien civilizations viewed humanity's rapid technological advancement as a threat to their traditional dominance in galactic affairs. He argued that the charges against Kane were an attempt to use legal mechanisms to control human development, Because direct competition had proven unsuccessful, the gallery erupted in angry protests from alien representatives who saw Marcus's arguments as accusations of anti-human conspiracy. Judge Zethkar called for order and warned that further disruptions would result in the courtroom being cleared. The crystal being's body glowed with colors that suggested both anger and deep concern about the implications of Marcus's arguments. Marcus continued by presenting evidence of the economic benefits that human innovation had brought to alien civilizations, including technologies that had solved problems the aliens had struggled with for centuries. He argued that the galaxy was better off with diverse approaches to innovation, rather than conformity to a single model of technological development. He addressed the prosecution's claims about human unreliability by showing that human emotional volatility was actually a sophisticated information processing system that allowed rapid adaptation to changing circumstances. Marcus argued that this cognitive flexibility was essential for innovation and that attempts to suppress it would harm both humans and aliens. The most powerful part of Marcus's argument involved his own story as a black man from Detroit who had lost everything and rebuilt his life as a janitor, only to find himself defending a billionaire in an alien court. He argued that this kind of impossible journey was fundamentally human, and that the refusal to accept limitations was what made humanity valuable to galactic civilization. Marcus told the court that humans saw opportunity where other species saw only chaos, and that this perspective had consistently led to breakthroughs that benefited everyone. He argued that protecting humanity's right to be different was not just about fairness, but about preserving a cognitive resource that the galaxy could not afford to lose. As his closing argument reached its climax, Marcus directly challenged the court to decide whether the Federation would be a community of diverse species working together, or a hierarchy where established powers controlled the development of newer members. He argued that Kane's conviction would establish the principle that different ways of thinking were threats to be controlled, rather than resources to be valued. Advocate Silthran responded with a closing argument that painted Marcus's defense as paranoid conspiracy theories designed to distract from Kane's clear violations of Federation law. She argued that humans were using claims of cognitive differences to excuse their refusal to participate in the collaborative systems that made galactic civilization possible. The Serpentine prosecutor dismissed Marcus's evidence of prosecutorial misconduct as misinterpretation of normal legal coordination, and denied that alien corporations had any improper influence on the case. She argued that the threats against witnesses were isolated incidents that had no bearing on Kane's guilt or innocence. Silthran concluded by arguing that Kane's conviction was necessary to establish that no species was above Federation law and that technology sharing requirements applied equally to all members, regardless of their claims about cognitive differences. She portrayed the prosecution as defending the principle of equality that was fundamental to galactic civilization. During the prosecution's closing argument, Marcus noticed several of the unknown beings he had spotted in the gallery earlier, making subtle hand signals to each other. He realized that the conspiracy was preparing to implement their backup plans, regardless of the trial's outcome, and that both he and Kane were in immediate danger. As closing arguments concluded, Judge Zethkar announced that the court would deliberate for 3 days before rendering a verdict. The crystal being's body showed colors that indicated deep uncertainty about issues that went far beyond the specific charges against Kane. The case had raised fundamental questions about the nature of galactic civilization that had no easy answers. Marcus and Kane left the courtroom together, knowing that they had done everything possible to defend not just Kane's innocence, but humanity's right to remain uniquely human. The next 3 days would determine whether the galactic legal system was capable of recognizing the value of cognitive diversity, or whether it would become a tool for enforcing conformity. The media coverage of closing arguments sparked protests and demonstrations across the galaxy, as different species debated the fundamental questions that Marcus had raised about innovation cooperation and the right to be different. Public opinion was sharply divided, with some supporting human cognitive independence, while others demanded conformity to established galactic norms. Kane offered Marcus a position as chief legal officer of Kane Industries regardless of the trial's outcome, but Marcus declined to discuss his future until they knew whether he would be alive to have one. He had exposed powerful enemies who would not hesitate to eliminate threats to their plans for controlling human development. As they waited for the verdict, Marcus and Cain both understood that their personal fates were now secondary to the larger questions about humanity's place in galactic civilization. They had fought not just for Cain's freedom, but for their species' right to contribute to the galaxy in their own unique way. The 3 days of deliberation would determine whether humanity remained free to pursue its chaotic, creative approach to innovation, or whether it would be forced into the rigid hierarchical systems preferred by the galaxy's established powers. Everything that made humans special was now on trial in a crystal courtroom on a distant world where a janitor had become humanity's last hope for independence. The 3 days of deliberation felt like an eternity as Marcus and Cain waited in the courthouse guest quarters, under protective custody that Judge Zethkar had ordered. After receiving credible threats against both men, Federation security forces had uncovered evidence that unknown parties were planning to eliminate key witnesses, regardless of the trial's outcome. During those long hours, Marcus told Cain the full story of his illegal investigation and the conspiracy he had discovered. The billionaire was shocked to learn that the forces arrayed against them included a secret council of alien civilizations that viewed humanity as a threat to galactic stability. Cain now understood that his trial was just the opening move in a campaign to subjugate his entire species. On the morning of the 3rd day, crowds gathered outside the courthouse as beings from across the galaxy arrived to witness the verdict that would shape interspecies relations for generations to come. Human colonists had traveled from distant worlds to show support for Cain, while alien protesters demanded that humanity be forced to conform to established galactic norms. Marcus noticed increased security around the courthouse, including armed guards from species he had never seen before. Federation intelligence services had apparently uncovered additional threats related to the Galactic Stability Council's plans to eliminate anyone who opposed their agenda. The conspiracy was larger and more dangerous than even Marcus had realized. Judge Zethkar entered the courtroom with his crystal body glowing colors that indicated deep contemplation mixed with resolve. The massive being had spent 3 days wrestling with legal and philosophical questions that challenged the fundamental assumptions underlying galactic civilization. His verdict would establish precedents that would influence interspecies relations for centuries. The Crystal Judge began by acknowledging that the case had raised issues far beyond the specific charges against Cain. He noted that the trial had exposed fundamental disagreements about the nature of innovation cooperation and the right of different species to maintain their unique approaches to problem-solving within the framework of galactic civilization. Judge Zethkar announced that after careful consideration of all evidence and arguments, the court found Richard Cain not guilty of violating the technology sharing accords. The judge explained that the prosecution had failed to prove that Cain's actions were motivated by selfish hoarding rather than legitimate concerns about successful technology transfer between species with different cognitive styles. The verdict sent waves of shock and celebration through the courtroom as humans cheered, while many aliens sat in stunned silence. But Judge Zethkar was not finished with his announcement, and what came next would be even more significant than Cain's acquittal. The crystal being announced that the court was establishing what he called the human variance doctrine, which legally recognized that different species contributed to galactic civilization in fundamentally different ways. The doctrine established that humanity's chaotic, individualistic approach to innovation was not a flaw to be corrected, but a unique contribution to be protected and valued. Judge Zethkar explained that the doctrine set legal precedent requiring that no species could be forced to conform to the cultural or cognitive norms of others as long as their differences contributed to the common good of galactic civilization. The ruling protected not just humans but any species whose natural approaches to innovation differed from established galactic standards. The judge addressed the evidence of witness intimidation and prosecutorial misconduct that had emerged during the trial. He announced that a full investigation would be launched into the conspiracy behind Cain's prosecution and that any individuals or organizations found guilty of corrupting the legal process would face severe consequences. Under Federation law, Judge Zethkar's Most shocking announcement involved the exposure of the Galactic Stability Council and their plan to use legal mechanisms to control human technological development. The crystal being revealed that Federation intelligence services had been investigating the secret organization for months and that Kane's trial had provided the evidence needed to expose their illegal activities. The courtroom erupted in chaos as the implications of the judge's revelations became clear to the assembled aliens and humans. Several alien representatives attempted to leave the gallery, but were stopped by Federation security forces who were executing arrest warrants that had been prepared during the deliberation period. Among those arrested was the human voice that Marcus had heard during his illegal investigation of the prosecution offices. The man turned out to be a former Federation trade official who had been bribed by alien corporations to help establish legal precedents that would limit human technological independence. His arrest sent shock waves through the human community on Nexus. Prime Judge Zethkar concluded his verdict by praising Marcus's defense of Kane as an example of humanity's greatest strength, which was the refusal to accept defeat even in impossible circumstances. The crystal being noted that a janitor becoming an effective galactic lawyer demonstrated the kind of individual achievement that made humans valuable contributors to galactic civilization. The judge announced that the human variance doctrine would be transmitted to all Federation member worlds as binding legal precedent that would guide future interactions between species with different approaches to innovation and development. The ruling effectively ended any legal basis for forcing technological conformity on unwilling species. Kane was officially cleared of all charges and his company's reputation was restored with full recognition that his careful approach to technology sharing had been responsible and beneficial rather than selfish. The billionaire was also granted compensation for the legal costs and business disruption caused by the malicious prosecution. Several alien corporations that had participated in the conspiracy faced immediate legal consequences, including massive fines and restrictions on their operations in human space. The Regellian Science Consortium and Centauri Industrial Complex both lost their licenses to operate in Federation territory and their executives faced criminal charges. As the courtroom emptied, Marcus found himself surrounded by reporters and legal scholars who wanted to understand how a janitor had managed to expose a conspiracy and save his species from technological subjugation. He answered their questions politely, but made it clear that he was more interested in the future implications of the human variance doctrine than in personal recognition. Kane approached Marcus with an offer to become chief legal officer of Kane Industries at a salary that would make him wealthy beyond his dreams. Marcus surprised everyone by declining the offer and instead announcing his intention to establish the first human legal aid society on Nexus, primed to provide representation for humans and aliens who could not afford expensive lawyers. The billionaire immediately pledged to fund the legal aid society as his way of thanking Marcus for saving not just his company but his entire species from a conspiracy that would have reduced humans to second-class status in galactic civilization. Kane understood that Marcus's decision to help others rather than enrich himself demonstrated the values that made humanity special. 6 months later, Marcus sat in his new office, which he still cleaned himself every evening out of habit and personal preference. The Human Legal Aid Society had already handled dozens of cases involving cross-species legal issues and had established a reputation for understanding the cultural complexities that often confuse traditional galactic lawyers. Kane visited regularly to discuss legal issues affecting his company, and the two men had developed an unlikely friendship based on mutual respect and shared experiences with injustice. The billionaire often joked that hiring a janitor as his lawyer was the best business decision he had ever made. Marcus's next major case involved defending a young human artist who was accused of cultural contamination for teaching aliens about jazz music. As he reviewed the case files, Marcus smiled, knowing that humanity's greatest strength would always be its refusal to be anything other than uniquely, creatively, chaotically human. The human variance doctrine had opened the door for other species with unconventional approaches to innovation, and several alien civilizations had already applied for protection under its provisions. The galaxy was slowly becoming more accepting of cognitive diversity as the benefits of different thinking styles became apparent. New generation of human lawyers was arriving on Nexus Prime, trained in both human and galactic law and ready to defend, not just individual clients but the right of all species to contribute to civilization in their own unique ways. The janitor who had become a lawyer had become a symbol across the galaxy of humanity's ability to succeed in impossible circumstances. The story that had begun with a desperate billionaire facing false charges had ended with legal recognition. That being different was not a crime but a gift that made galactic civilization stronger and more resilient. Humanity had earned the right to remain human while contributing their chaotic creativity to the greater good of all species in the galaxy.